Okay, and we're ready to get started. So if you're here, I'm hoping you're here for executive functioning and behavior. What's the connection? We are going to spend about an hour today talking about the joys of executive functioning, what it is, how it works, and then kind of how students who struggle with executive functioning may also be struggling with behavior and how that connection happens, in schools, out of schools, everywhere else. So as we're going through today, I will have the chat up. It is on a screen right below where I'm looking at you guys and the main screen right now. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. Your chat is down there. So I will be checking it from time to time just to kind of follow up and see if you guys have any questions. So definitely feel free to use the chat as we go through today. So my name's Cassie Frost. If you haven't seen me anywhere else, I am an assistive technology specialist and behavior specialist. And then I always like adding in these other fun things of problem solver and collector of things that may come in handy. Really enjoy the blurred background because it hides my closet back there that has all of those random things that I collect that may come in handy. And most importantly, a believer that everyone can learn. Some of my professional affiliations are down at the bottom of the screen here. I am an ATP, the president of the Wisconsin CEC. So many letters. I really like this. ATP, CEC, D, just lots of letters I've got going on down there. And my Twitter handle at cfrost_disteach. If you are a Twitterer or a tweeter, definitely you can reach out to me there. So as we go through this hour, we're going to start off with kind of a brief executive functioning 101. I like doing this at the beginning of any session that I spend talking about executive functioning in any capacity, just because it's important for us to all be on the same page and kind of have the same working understanding of executive functioning. So if you feel like you already know quite a bit about executive functioning, hang on through this first period. No, that's not where we're going to be staying, but I do need to make sure that everybody that is here today kind of is on the same page as we are moving forward. Then we're going to spend some time talking specifically about behavior and executive functioning and how those interact with each other. We're going to talk a little bit then about the functions of behavior and why behaviors show up. Spend some time talking about cause and effect, and then we're going to get into what I usually like calling in these types of things kind of the quick wins. So some of the systems to support executive functioning and some AT support specifically. So that's kind of the outline for today. If we do end up having a lot of questions or one area or the other, we may spend a little bit more time on one than the other, and I'm completely okay with that. I also like kind of at the beginning, letting everybody know that as we get towards the end of the session today, I do have a bunch of more technology tools, kind of like Chrome extensions, iPads, apps, things like that, that can help support individuals who are struggling in one or more areas of executive functioning. We may or may not have time to get to demonstrating all of those today. I like including them in the slides so that you can go back and look at them later. They are in the handout, so you definitely have access to all of them. And if we have time, I will demonstrate some of those. However, sometimes as the session gets going on, if people ask questions, things like that, I would rather spend time in that area during the training itself and then allow people to look at those individually. So just be aware if we don't get to all of those, no need to panic. That's completely okay. I set it up that way for a reason. So before we go to this next slide, I want to take just a minute and kind of set the scene a little bit. So I want you to imagine that you are getting ready for work in the morning. And you know that today you are doing a certain activity at work and you need to bring something with you. So that could be that there is a birthday party for somebody at work and you are responsible for bringing the cupcakes. Or it could be that maybe you are doing a lab activity in the classroom that you're teaching and you are expected to bring popsicle sticks, right? But there's stuff on the counter you've bought, it's there, and you need to take it with you. And then something happens. The phone rings, the shower breaks, you forgot to start the coffee pot, you overslept, you're kind of rushing around in the morning, and you race out the door and you forget those items on the counter. My question to you is, how are you feeling at that point? Now, you don't have to answer that. But internally, a lot of people will tell me, even as I'm describing that, they're starting to feel a little anxious. When you get to work, you get to where you're going, and you realize you've forgotten those things. Typically, there's a pretty consistent internal dialogue that starts happening. Oh my goodness, I forgot that. I can't believe I did that. Why did I forget that? I'm so stupid, right? I'm frustrated. I knew I had a list. I should have put that in my car last night. One or more of these things usually start happening. And if at that point you walk into your building, you walk into your place of employment, and somebody says something to you that's mildly irritating. On a normal day, you might be like, okay, that was mildly irritating. This day, you're much more likely to respond in a negative way. You may snap at that person. You may say something not so nice to that person. You might just outright blow that person off, right? In that moment, that's behavior. You are displaying an unexpected and unpleasant, not professional behavior based off of something that went wrong with your executive functioning. Your memory, your routines, your systems that day didn't work the way they normally would. Because of that, you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed and maybe have some behavior that you wouldn't normally have. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So it's important as we kind of get started to recognize that even as adults, even as professionals, our executive functioning system can go a little wonky from time to time. We can have errors where things just don't go right, and we can have behavior because of that. Okay. So now as we get into this today, I kind of want you to hang on to that a little bit. I want you to remember that as we're talking about this, we all do it. Okay? Because sometimes it's easy to think about them and kids and students and those people over there, instead of kind of beginning to be a little more empathetic and recognizing that we all do this. Okay. So now that I've kind of got everybody anxious thinking about the last time that you did this, we're going to get started. So first off, kind of our overview of executive functioning. This is the big old definition. This is here from ASHA's website. And the slide reads, executive functioning as related to schools includes all self-management skills students need to succeed in a classroom. More specifically, it involves the ability to make goals, plan steps required to achieve those goals, and then execute the plans. For example, attention, focus, planning, organization, working memory, recall, self-regulating emotions, and self-monitoring all fall under the umbrella of executive functions. This is a big definition, and it's very accurate. Executive functioning is this big category that kind of underlies everything else that happens. It's our attention, it's our focus, it's our planning, it's our organizational skills. It's all of those underlying things that need to be working right in order for us to do everything else. So I like making this a little more simple. Okay, and here's my definition of executive functioning. Executive functioning is how you get yourself together to do the things you need to do, and that includes learning. Pretty simple, but yet not. So executive functioning is all of those things that you need to do to get yourself together to do the things you need to do. That may be things like making a list. That may be like setting things out on the counter the night before. That can be your organization and your memory and your time management and setting alarms, getting yourself kind of ready to do all of the things. So as we're talking about executive functioning today, and we kind of move into how this can affect behavior, I kind of want you to draw your attention to a few of the things that we're really going to kind of hone in on. So while executive functioning covers a lot of areas, we're going to focus in on the areas that are here on the screen. So we have working memory, which is kind of that memory and processing piece. We have inhibitory control, which we're going to call attention. We have cognitive flexibility, so being able to switch from one thing to the other and process what's going on around us. And then those three things together also greatly impact our ability to organize and manage our time. So today we're going to talk about attention, organization, time management, and memory. So we're going to break these down just a little bit so that we kind of have an idea where all these little things can kind of start going wrong. Okay. Because remember, typically for behaviors that are unexpected or behaviors that we don't want to see to happen, typically it means that something's not quite going right. So it's important for us to know kind of how do these things break down. And to do that, we're going to start with attention. Now, the interesting thing about attention is hierarchical. What that means is you have to attain one level of attention before moving on to the next. So at its core, we start out with focused attention, focusing on one stimuli. For example, I like using the example of a baby or an infant for this. I actually just got to witness this the other day. So somebody picks up a newborn baby and you make all the goofy little, noises and expressions right at them. And that infant is looking around and suddenly stops and looks at you. That's focused attention, right? You can focus in on one thing. Most of the students that we work with have this. The next level of attention then is sustained attention. How long can you sustain that focused attention? We know that toddlers can sustain attention typically a lot shorter time period than adults can. We typically expect throughout a school, career that students in the younger grades, kindergarten, first grade, can sustain attention much shorter periods of time than fifth graders, sixth graders, eighth graders, 10th graders, and seniors, right? We expect that attention span gets longer over time. Now, the interesting thing again with attention, being that it is hierarchical, means that we have to be able to focus our attention and sustain our attention sufficiently before we can start working on selective attention. So if you have a student that you know can only stay focused on one thing for about 5 minutes, we can't expect them then to have selective attention outside of those 5 minutes at a time. And even within those 5 minutes, it's going to be very difficult because they haven't quite got sustained attention down yet. Okay. Assuming everything's went well, focused attention is good, sustained attention is good, then we can work on selective attention. And this is that freedom from distractibility part. This means that the student can ignore the pencil rolling down the desk behind them. They can ignore the passing time going on in the hall with all of the kids talking. It means they cannot be distracted by things outside the window from the classroom. For most people, usually as I'm talking about this part, I kind of start to see light bulbs go off, right? There's usually somebody going, oh yeah, I have a student who struggles here, right? So we're starting to see students start to struggle between how long can they sustain attention and how easily they cannot be distracted by everything that's going on around them. So we know we have students who are really struggling in this area. This is hard for them. But now we have another level. If we have focused attention, sustained attention, and selective attention, now we can start developing alternating attention. And what that means is students or adults, humans as a whole, are able to switch from one task to another. And so this is alternating attention, meaning being able to go from what I'm paying attention to here and switching to something else, and then perhaps switching back again. But I'm alternating my attention from one thing to another. In a school system, a lot of times this could be like maybe a student is filling out their planner and the teacher says, okay, hold on, I need to do lunch count. Okay, so I need to stop working on my planner. I need to listen to the teacher for lunch count, and then I can go back to my planner. Or, the teacher has you, watching a video and then pauses it to ask a question, right? So that's alternating attention, switching from one thing to another. For many of our students, this is really difficult, and that's something we ask students to do all the time. Right? We're typically asking students to switch back and forth between things. Maybe the teacher is teaching something from the front of the classroom and then is pausing while the students write down notes. Okay? These are activities that we do pretty regularly. Now, assuming that goes well, We have focused attention. We can sustain attention for a sufficient amount of time. We cannot be distracted by everything else around us. We can alternate our attention between a couple of things. Then we can move into divided attention. A lot of times this is called multitasking. What it means is really, really quick alternating attention. You can switch back and forth between multiple things so quickly that it kind of appears you're doing two things at once. In our school system, by the time students are hitting 5th, 6th, 7th grade, we require or expect students to be able to do a lot of multitasking. So for example, watching a video and taking notes, listening to the teacher and filling out a worksheet, right? Packing up their homework, right? Packing up for the end of the day and listening to the end of the day announcements. We're expecting students to be able to do two things pretty regularly. And for most of our students, that's probably okay. But for our students who struggle with executive functioning and specifically attention, this can be very difficult, primarily because if they're still working at being able to sustain attention for longer than 5 minutes, and you're expecting them to listen to a 30-minute lecture and take notes, it's not going to work. And as we go through today and start talking more and more about the behavior portion of this, I want you to remember this, because when you're being asked to do something that you can't do, you don't have yet the skills to do, it doesn't feel very good. Feels an awful lot like when you got to work and forgot whatever it was you needed on the counter, right? So again, attention is kind of the root of a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. And so I like starting off with attention because the next thing we're going to talk about is memory. And if you notice on the screen, I have kind of the steps of memory. Now, this is really the basic steps of memory. We could do multiple hours of a training just on memory and how it works. And I couldn't even do that justice because there's so much science behind it. But what we do know is that in order for memory to work well, first things first, somebody has to be able to pay attention to something to be able to get that input. So if attention's not going well, memory is going to struggle also. So if we can attend to something, then that information has to be encoded into our brain, stored, consolidated, and retrieved when we need it. If it's current working memory, this process is happening really quickly, right? But if a student's not able to attend in the first place or something else goes wrong in here, all of a sudden our memory's not working as well as it should. So when we see students who are struggling with memory, a lot of times we're going to look first at helping support that attention piece. And then after that, looking at supports to help support students, because we're not necessarily always going to be able to fix all of those memory pieces. When we're talking about that processing and switching piece, right, moving from one thing to another, it's important here to also recognize how many pieces are involved. In order to switch from one task to another, you need to be able to hear a cue or see a cue, recognize its meaning, and then respond accordingly. So you have to remember that that audio or a visual cue means something. You have to be able to think about what it means and then know what you're supposed to do from it. So again, this involves attention and memory in order to do this. Once you have heard or seen a cue, recognize that it has meaning, then we go into these next pieces. How fast can you go through that process? How fast can you recognize this cue, know what it is, and be ready to move on? How quickly can you motor plan? How quickly can you figure out with your body how you need to do the next steps? So for most of us, this is pretty natural. We've learned over time how our body needs to move to do the things we need to do. For some students, motor planning is very difficult. So for example, if we were to ask a student to, pause what you're doing, reading that book, and run to your locker to get something, they need to recognize that cue, process what it means, stop doing the reading, motor plan with their body how they're going to turn in their desk, stand up, walk to the door, open the door, walk down the hall, get to their locker, get the items out of their locker. There's a lot to that. And if that's not a smooth process, if we have students who struggle here, then we run into that issue with the time management piece, because this takes longer for them to get out of their desk and do all of the things they were just asked to do. Now, again, a little preview into that behavior piece. If a student's asked to put away their book or stop reading and run to their locker to get something and come back, and they don't go through this process as quickly as the majority of their peers do, what is it that typically happens next? Okay. If you want to answer in the chat, you certainly can. Otherwise, just think about it. That's fine too. What typically happens next here? Typically, the teacher or an educational assistant may give another cue, right? We might prompt again, thinking they didn't hear. So now the student's trying to recognize that second cue, right? And then maybe the student's starting to feel some frustration. Maybe the educator is starting to feel a little frustration. Usually there's an assumption here that the student is being non-compliant or not doing what they're expected to do. And we have a situation that's escalating very quickly into the student's not listening, they're being defiant, they're not doing what they're being asked to do, the student's feeling frustrated, and things can escalate into that area of unexpected or disruptive behaviors rather quickly. So again, we started pretty simple. We started with not maybe having a long attention span or not being able to be, non-distracted by the things that go, not being able to be non-distracted. Let's go, not being distracted by, we'll go with that. Not being distracted by the things around you, to now this can escalate fairly quickly into assuming that a student is being non-compliant. And then we have this area of organization. So we're still talking about executive functioning here, right? Attention, memory, switching and processing, organization. But the organization piece sometimes is the thing we might notice the most. So if we have a student that we feel is maybe displaying some behaviors that are kind of raising some flags for us, a lot of times we kind of will look back a little bit at their organizational system and their organizational world and kind of notice, are there some flags there? Are some things that maybe we could notice? A student who is struggling with organization sometimes is more easily observed because organization is more of a physical thing. That attention and that memory and that processing is kind of a lot of internal stuff where we might not be able to notice it as much, right? As an educator looking at the student. But the organization piece, we might notice when a desk is messy or a locker is messy, right? And we do have a lot of things that students are responsible for organization. So for example, students are expected to organize in their home environment and their personal spaces. But it's important here to recognize that everybody's home has a different organizational system. Some students may come from a home that's very well organized, and parents are very big on organization and have defined spaces for things, and that's great. And we also might have students coming from a home environment where a new baby's been born, or they've just gotten a new puppy and things aren't where they used to be, and everything's kind of all disorganized or in different places, or their organizational system might just look very different than what's expected at school. And we need to recognize that. Just because it might look different doesn't mean there's not one there. Students are also expected to organize their desks, their lockers, their digital worlds, right? Expectations for organization are very different across classrooms, home environments, school environments. And it's important to recognize that organization sometimes isn't super consistent. We might have things organized in one classroom a certain way, but if they go to a different classroom, things might be organized very differently. And we have to remember when we're talking about organization that we don't necessarily direct instruct on this as students get older. In kindergarten and first grade, we tend to help students a lot. We help them clean their desks, we help them clean out their locker spaces, we help them get things into the right folders, and we kind of teach that organization piece. But as students get older in third, fourth, fifth, sixth, junior high, we don't necessarily instruct on organization anymore. We kind of assume that students should have that under control from an earlier age. But we know that some students don't. And unfortunately, we don't really necessarily have the system in place to continue to teach that as students get older. And I just saw Kristen, I'm going to jump in for your quote here in the chat. Kristen said that digital organization is so huge and hard to observe day to day. So for schools that use Google Classroom, it organizes for them. However, once they don't have that LMS or they use to a different one, they don't know how to organize or make folders to save their files. They need to be directly taught. Yes, thank you for that. So that is a phenomenal point. And what's really interesting about the digital world in specifics is because we kind of had this gradual change into the digital world where we started, with Microsoft files where you had to save and save as, and we kind of started learning to name those. And then all of a sudden, everything went kind of the Google Classroom way or Google Drive or auto save, right? You open a file and it automatically saves for you. And about that time, we had this huge switch into so much digital learning. And it happened so quickly at that point that we didn't necessarily realize that we weren't teaching those digital skills necessarily. Even as an adult, I feel like I never necessarily initially had been taught or learned how to name my files and save my files well. That's something I had to work on. And for our students, we aren't as good at helping them organize their digital worlds as maybe we were their paper. So for example, when you handed out papers to students, one of the first things in every classroom, every teacher said was, put your name on your paper. All right, put your name on your paper, put your name on your paper. But when you open up a file, we don't typically tell students, now make sure to name your file this way, right? And some teachers are starting to, but it's kind of a whole thing that was missed. And so we definitely need to do some work there. And you're right, different LMSs handle organization differently. And those are things we need to figure out. How are we going to put time in place to help support students? And then all of those pieces, right? The attention, the memory, the processing, the organization, all play underneath this idea of time management. There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so much time. It needs to be managed. One of the hardest things about time is very abstract. If you are in a meeting at the end of the school day talking about a topic that maybe you're not interested in at all, not that that ever happens, and you're there for 30 minutes, that 30 minutes can feel like 3 or 4 hours. Now, if you're in the store and you run into a good friend you haven't seen in 6 months, and you're standing in the middle of the baking aisle and you're just catching up, you could be blocking that aisle for a half hour and it feels like you've been talking for 5 minutes. That same 30 minutes can feel incredibly different based on how you're feeling about it. So when you're trying to teach time and work with students on time, it can be very difficult because it is so abstract. So some of the things that kind of come into mind with time management is kind of that idea of starting with the end in mind, knowing what your goal is, right? Because for some students, if they don't know what they're working towards, they have no idea how to get there. Also, if you're working with individuals with ADHD, you'll sometimes hear the words time blindness thrown around. And that's just kind of pointing out the fact that for a lot of individuals who've been diagnosed with ADHD, time is really non-existent. They really don't understand the passage of time. Time is a very abstract, even more so, thing for those individuals. Interruptions can play into time management. If a student thinks they're on a good path and they know how they're getting from point A to point B and they're good on time and they're interrupted, it can be very hard for that student to know how long that interruption was, right? Like that quick 2-minute question may feel like now they've lost 30 minutes of their work time. Or vice versa, they may feel like it was super fast and it really took longer and now they're going to run out of time. And then just being aware that if a student is struggling with attention, organization, or memory, likely that is going to affect their time management skills. So we've talked a little bit about behavior in the beginning of this. But now I really want to talk about where does behavior come from? What causes some of the behaviors that we maybe are wanting to avoid seeing in our classrooms? And then how can we support that? So just like with executive functioning, we needed to all be on the same page. And we are working under the idea that executive functioning is what we do to get ourselves together to do the things we need to do. Just like with that, there's two behavior principles that I want to make sure that we are kind of all coming to this conversation with. The first one is pretty simple. It's that every child wakes up wanting to be successful. I truly believe this. I don't believe that on any given day, any child wakes up in the morning wanting to have their teacher disappointed in them, wanting to get a call home and coming home to mom or dad being upset with them, wanting to have, miss their lunch, wanting to have their peers look at them in a negative way, right? Every child wakes up wanting to be successful. They may or may not have the skills to do that. They may be very frustrated and cause the people around them to be very frustrated. And it may feel like they're trying to push triggers. And at some point, maybe they even are. But at their core, they want to be successful. And the second one here is just as important. And this is the idea that all people exhibit behavior to get what they want or need. As we're coming through our conversations today now, we're going to talk about behavior as not being good or bad. Behavior is simply what people do to get what they want or need. You display behaviors all day, every day to get what you want or need. That can be good things like getting up early to work out. That's a behavior. Going to work to get a paycheck. That's a behavior. Smiling at a friend so that they smile back and they like you. That's a behavior. Okay. So the two things we're going to be talking about here, or kind of coming from, is that every child wakes up wanting to be successful, and all people exhibit behavior to get what they want or need. So some of the examples, just like we talked about before, we might smile at people, we might wave, we might avoid people, right? If we walk on the far side of the hallway because we don't want to talk to someone, that's behavior, and go to work. It's important to remember that the student behavior that we are kind of talking about today is communicating a need. So that being said, typically in the behavioral world, we'll talk about functions of behavior. All that means are kind of the primary reason or the primary purpose of the behavior. Why is the behavior happening? And here are some of those really common ones. So a lot of times a behavior might be happening. And again, when I'm going to say behavior here, I'm going to say kind of those behaviors we're not wanting to see, right? Some people will call them unexpected behaviors, negative behavior, disruptive behavior, whatever that may be. But those behaviors are typically going to happen for one of these reasons. It could be avoidance. They might want to be avoiding a peer, a staff member, an adult, or a task that's either too easy or too hard. They could be seeking attention, looking for attention from peers or an adult in their world. The student feels like they don't get enough attention somewhere, they're going to find a way to get it, right? We do this as adults too, right? If we're feeling like we just need to talk to someone, we usually go find someone to talk to, right? Students necessarily don't have it that easy because they need to be in class and shouldn't be talking at that point. We also have a function of control and power. So this one will come up a lot if a student is feeling like they can't control a situation. So if they're feeling like things in their world are out of their control, they will try to control other things. Even as adults, if our world is really overwhelming and there's a lot going on, maybe it's a certain time of school year, or there's been some sort of dramatic change in your world, like family members in the hospital, things like that. When things start feeling out of control, we try to control what we can. And that may be the time when we get upset or snippy with a coworker for, rearranging something in a classroom, right? That's not how I wanted that. And it's really not that big of a deal. But in that moment, we're trying to control all those little things because we need to control something. Another function of behavior may just be self-regulatory or sensory. So if a student is uncomfortable in a sensory way or needs some internal self-regulation, they may display behaviors to get that need met. Students may display behavior to obtain a task or an activity. A lot of times this may come if they've been told no, or if they want something that they can't have, right? So we may have a student that's displaying negative behavior because they want something and they're thinking that by doing this behavior, they're going to get it. And then it can also just be a skill deficit. So if a student hasn't been direct taught an organizational system, their stuff may be a really big mess and they might not get things turned in on time. That may be a skill deficit, right? It may be that they have an academic skill deficit, right? So they're displaying behaviors to avoid that. So we've kind of got the skill deficit and avoidance together. It may be that they just don't know how to talk to other people, right? They have that kind of interpersonal difficulties. But a lot of times there may be a skill deficit somewhere that's making them uncomfortable. And then some of these other functions may kind of come out on top of that. So it's important when we think of the student that we see that, wow, this behavior is not great. We want to do something about this behavior. Typically, we're going to really want to start here with this function of behavior and then kind of look back for some of those executive functioning cues also, right? Are there some struggles in one of those areas that may be making these things happen? So then it's also important to consider some other possible reasons for behavior. And that may be things like manifestations of a mental health disorder, like ADHD, depression, anxiety. It could be learned helplessness, a student that has learned that they just can't do it on their own. They can't do it, so why try? There may be some embarrassment. Okay, as students get older, a lot of times we'll use the phrase, they're saving face. So if a student is feeling embarrassed because they can't do something, they may display some pretty disruptive or unexpected behaviors. Or the idea of fear of failure, meaning the student just feels like they can't get it wrong, right? If they do it wrong, then that means that they're never going to be able to do it right. People are going to be disappointed in them, so I'm not even going to try. Okay. So here's kind of some of these questions. Here's where we're going to talk about that cause and effect piece. So we've talked about executive functioning, right? We've kind of laid the groundwork, understanding that that is that attention, organization, time management, memory. Kind of talked about that behavior that students, when they're struggling, right? They may try to avoid a situation. They may try to control a situation. They may try to save face, right? So we have all of these kind of disruptive things that happen when kids are uncomfortable. But now we need to think about that cause and effect. How is a student, or how do you feel if you forgot to bring your materials to work with you? And we talked about that one just a minute ago. In that case, one area of our executive functioning system failed. Maybe we weren't as organized as we could have been. Maybe our time management wasn't great. Maybe we didn't pay attention to what time it was. But regardless, some part of our executive functioning system failed. We forgot to bring our materials to work with us. We might be embarrassed if we have to tell our coworkers that we didn't do that. We might feel frustrated and maybe a little angry at ourselves, right? Those aren't comfortable feelings. How do you feel if the pair of pants you wanted to wear are in the wash? Right? You had in your head that that was the pair of pants you wanted to wear. Now, this might even get into some of that sensory piece, right? Those are the ones that were fit right. They felt right. That's what we wanted to wear that day. Now we have to wear the pair that are maybe itchy, right? Or just don't fit the way we wanted them to. So again, now something didn't work there. We didn't plan accordingly. We didn't remember that we needed to, right? We didn't remember that they were in their wash. Maybe our memory didn't work quite as well there, right? Part of that executive functioning system didn't work quite the way we wanted it to. Now we're frustrated. We ran out of time on a report that was due, right? Our time management skills and our organization wasn't quite where we needed it to be. Now we have to decide, are we going to, own up to that and ask for more time? Or are we going to turn it in partially done? Are we going to be embarrassed? Are we going to have to talk to a supervisor and say, we need more time? You didn't remember you needed to buy a birthday present. Now that brings in that social aspect, right? Now you might have people that you're afraid are going to think you don't like them, or you're going to be embarrassed by that. Or just plain and simple, if you're sick and feeling brain foggy. It's important to realize that even those of us with pretty solid executive functioning systems, if you're not feeling well or something's went wrong, you can very easily start to slip in some areas of executive functioning. We all know that when we're on the top of our game and everything's going well, we might be pretty good, or we might have kind of some strategies in place to help support our executive functioning system. But when you're sick and you're feeling kind of brain foggy, that memory, that attention can be a lot harder to hold on to. So here's the thing. I worked with a counselor years and years and years ago, and I really loved her saying, she used to always use the phrase that sad turns to mad turns to mean. And when we were working with students together, that was always her phrase. And I like that phrase. So if you forgot materials, you're feeling bad. You're feeling bad about yourself. You're feeling kind of sad that you dropped the ball. Sad is a very uncomfortable feeling. It's much easier to be mad. So you can be mad at yourself. You can be irritated with the people around you. And when you're feeling mad, it's much easier to be mean, right? And that's where we start seeing that behavior piece. So when somebody says, well, didn't you bring those materials? You may snap at them, right? And so this is the same thing with our students. When their executive functioning system is failing, when they are not organized and they don't have their assignment to turn in on time, right? They're disappointed in themselves. They wanted to be successful. They didn't have the assignment done. Now we can go back and say, well, why didn't you? You had time yesterday. You chose not to, right? But that may be that the time management piece wasn't there, that they didn't realize they needed as much time as they did. That's not saying that students don't ever choose to not do their work, because definitely that does happen. But for the students that we've identified who are struggling with organization, time management, or attention, more often than not, they had good intentions, but one of those things failed. Now they don't have their assignment to turn in. They're embarrassed. They're feeling uncomfortable. And they're not likely going to say, yes, I'm feeling really bad about not having that done. I don't know too many 7th graders, 5th graders, high school students are going to say, yeah, I don't have my assignment. I feel really bad that I didn't get it done last night. I should have done better, right? And so they're going to look at you and say, no, right? Maybe yell at you even a little bit about it, because that's easier to feel, okay? So when you feel frustrated, overwhelmed, out of control, we don't handle everyday stress as well. We don't handle interactions with others as well. And these functions of behavior might show up. So in the example of, do you have your assignment done for today? You may seek attention. You may start looking for, support, kind of the attention from your peers, right? To make you feel better about yourself. You may start trying to control the situation, right? Well, no, I needed this pencil to be able to do it, and I didn't have that. You may try to regulate yourself, right? You may need to leave a certain environment when you feel overwhelmed. You may need something quieter. Or you might just avoid that class altogether. Like, I know this is going to feel bad. I don't have the assignment done. This is going to feel very uncomfortable and be very embarrassing. I'm just going to avoid the situation altogether. So when those things start happening, we start seeing these functions of behavior. We start seeing students doing these types of things. So let's talk about this for a minute. At school, we have a lot of demands on our executive functioning systems. We have friendships. We have calendars and schedules. We have time restraints. We have rules that are different in every classroom. And then on top of that, we have, the whole teaching thing, right? That we're supposed to be learning in school. Somehow that comes into play too. So with this, we need to be able to use a time management system and an organizational system, and we need to have solid attention and memory in order to be truly successful. Now, for students who struggle in one or more areas of this, a lot of them have developed skills or strategies to help themselves. So some students will maybe latch on to like a whole color coding system, and they'll keep that through their school years. Some students may write notes for themselves to remind themselves how to do things. Some students may rely on looking at the clock very frequently, right? If you ever have a student that goes to a classroom that doesn't have a clock and starts getting very anxious about there not being a clock in that classroom, kind of let that be a flag, right? That student's checking that clock frequently. Most of the time, it's not because they're looking to get out of the classroom, but because they need to know how long they're there and how long they have, right? They need to know that because otherwise they can't plan accordingly. And so most students kind of develop those skills. They have their own little supports that work for them until they don't. So those kind of built-in skills, those things that students have learned, work until the demands are too much. So maybe if they can attend for 15 minutes at a time and they can focus that long and they do okay until they get to a class that's expecting them to sit and listen and attend for 30 minutes at a time. And now all of a sudden they're struggling. Maybe they're feeling anxious. Maybe they're avoiding the classroom. Maybe they are disruptive in that classroom, right? All of a sudden, we start seeing more of those behaviors pop up. And this happens frequently, that we'll kind of have these conversations that the student was doing pretty well, things were going well, and now all of a sudden they're not. What happened? And a lot of times we can track that back to noticing that the expectations have changed and the student supports that they kind of have relied on for so long are no longer working. So now what else can we do? So if we know that students have these supports that they've kind of developed on their own, and we know that our school still have certain expectations, what else can we do? So when we're looking at executive functioning, I like breaking down into kind of 4 key areas. I like looking at environmental supports, systematic supports, instructional supports, and individual supports. So when you have students who are kind of displaying a lot of behaviors, they're avoiding class, they're shutting down, they can't find their assignments, they're always behind, they're coming to class late. Here are some of the areas that we can look at supporting from an executive functioning, from a getting yourself together standpoint, that's going to give them a more comfortable school day, that's going to set them up for success in all those little underlying areas. So environmental supports, take a look at your classroom. This could be things like your classroom design, the windows in your classroom, how many people are in the room. It's important to know this can be really hard to change. We're not going to talk about this as much today because we can't really just go and say, well, take out a few bricks on that wall and make my room a little bigger. And it doesn't work that way. I wish it did, but it doesn't. But it's important to be aware when your classroom or your environmental, your classroom, your learning area just isn't quite beneficial from an environmental standpoint, because then you can kind of start recognizing that. If your classroom is right across from the lunchroom, for example, right, when it's lunchtime and there's a whole bunch of people in there talking, your students are probably going to have a harder time. And that's important to just be aware of. You might not be able to fix it, but you can be aware of and understanding with that. But then we can look at systematic supports. So things like routines and patterns and schedules, kind of things that happen on a systematic basis. We have instructional things about how are we teaching or interacting with students. Things like cueing phrases, lesson designs, how are we breaking down tasks? And then individual supports, things like accommodations, assistive tech, alternate locations, individual schedules. So here's where we're going to talk about some of these quick wins. So the ideas that I'm going to give you here next are things that if you notice that you have a student who is displaying some unexpected or disruptive behaviors, and you're also kind of noticing that they seem to be struggling in some of these executive functioning areas, right? Maybe you can't even draw a line necessarily directly from one to the other, but you know they're struggling in one of these executive functioning areas. So we're going to support that to see even if it brings down the anxiety to help decrease some of those behaviors, right? So it's important to know that you should not go back tomorrow or yet this afternoon and try out every single one of these. Okay. Some of these are fun, some of these work really well, but it doesn't mean that every student is going to benefit from every single one of them. So I want to show you a variety of them so you can think about them and work with your students and your teachers and everybody with them But just be aware that does not mean that you should go back and, give a solid shot to every single one of these. So some strategies that you can consider. The very first one of these, I actually recommend that everybody does do this one. Right after I got done saying don't do them all, I'm going to say this first one, give it a shot. I like calling this one the desk challenge. So when we're talking about attention, I challenge you to go sit wherever it is that your student who is struggling is sitting and look to where the learning is happening. So if you have a student who's sitting in the second row on the right-hand side of the classroom, go sit in that seat and look towards the front of the room or wherever the teacher teaches from. And pay attention to what do you see. In that line of sight, the only thing that should be there are things that happen instructionally. So maybe a calendar showing what's coming up and the teaching environment. If there are fun things up there like fun posters or a challenge that the whole school is doing or twinkling lights, move them, right? Move them from here back. They can still be in the room. There's nothing wrong with them, but take away those distractions from the area where learning is happening. Also, clean and organize your physical and digital world, just like Kristen said earlier in the chat. Helping your students organize that digital environment and teaching them how to do it will save them time when they're looking for their assignments, right? And help them get an organizational system in place. Whenever possible, work with color coding, right? Help students kind of identify that certain classes are certain colors, or maybe all summative assignments are certain colors, can help take out some of that stress. As much as possible, be consistent in your environment, making sure that if you always have students turn assignments in a certain place, make sure that that's where they always turn things in. Keeping things as consistent as possible can help students who are struggling with memory, organization, and attention. And assume positive intent. As frustrating as it can be to be waiting for that student to find the assignment that they are supposed to be turning in and everybody else has, and they're still digging through their folder, assume that they are trying to find it, right? Assume that they're doing the best they can instead of getting frustrated with them. We just had a comment in the chat for those of you that are watching a recording later, saying that think about glare on materials also. So when information is laminated, lamination can be hard to see due to glare. Absolutely. And that can go a long way from that whole desk challenge. Sometimes it's even a window like shining on a whiteboard can have an awful glare. And then students aren't actually seeing the information that's up there. So glare is a huge one. Providing visual supports for students. Things like countdown timers in the hallways, large screen displays like smart boards, using whiteboards or sticky notes or stick people, right? Visual supports don't always have to be super fancy, but giving students something they can look back at, especially for students who struggle with attention. So if they didn't hear the cue, but they can look back and see it again, that can be really, really, really helpful. Remember the recipe effect. So if you're looking for a recipe in a cookbook, online, you like looking for the recipes that look good, that they have a picture of what it looks like when it's done. And you like that for two reasons. One, it's more appealing, but two, as you're cooking, you know what it's supposed to look like when it's finished, right? That helps our brains to know, here's what I'm working for, here's what I'm going towards. And we try to make it look like that in the end. So as much as possible for your students, preview things for them. What should it look like? And then the repeat myself rule. Here's my rule. If you have to repeat something 3 times, make a visual. So if a student says, when is this due? And you answer it. And another student says, when do I need to turn this in? And you answer it. The third time that a student says, when is this due? Write it on the board, right? If a student says, where are the scissors? Where do I get the scissors? Third time, put a sign on the cabinet that says scissors. If you have to repeat yourself 3 times, make a visual. Doesn't have to be fancy. It can be a sticky note or stick people, but you do need to make that visual. I do have a link here to a website called classroomscreen.com. I'm going to jump out real quick to show this. So I like this one when I'm talking about visuals, because this is a free site. You can use the paid version. The paid version allows you to keep your screens from time to time. But what I like about this for visuals, if you have a projector and or a smartboard and or a screen of some form, this allows you to easily change the backgrounds to whatever you would like it to be. But it also allows you to write down directions or notes on the screen. You can tell students how loud it should be while they're working. There are things like clocks and timers that you can put up on your screen super easily. Even things like sound levels and traffic lights and poles. But for teachers who are saying, I need a visual for my students, if you don't have an easy way to do that, or you don't have access to a whiteboard or a big piece of paper, this provides a whole bunch of these tools all in one spot and free. And free is always good, right? Now, as we're getting to that wrap up time, I want to let you know that we're moving into the section now on individual supports. And I want to remind everybody that this isn't cheating, especially for students who are struggling with executive functioning, which is kind of that underlying thing. It's important to recognize that we all use supports in this. We write notes for ourselves, right? Like my Post-it notes here. We use our phones for all of these things. We all know that at some point we need supports in these areas. So it's important to recognize that our students do as well. And if those aren't in place, we start feeling really frustrated and overwhelmed. And then we can start displaying a lot of those unexpected behaviors. So the individual supports that you'll find in the rest of your handouts it's important to know they can be for individuals or groups of students. If it benefits one, it might be considered to help more. It's probably not going to be an immediate cure-all, meaning just because we've put a support in place, just because you make yourself a grocery list doesn't remember you're going to remember it all the time. Right? And it's important to consider how these integrate with the environment. So it could be great to have teach students how to use a list on their Chromebook. But if they go to a class where the teacher doesn't let them open their Chromebooks, it's probably not going to work as well. So kind of think about what environments your students are going to be in as you select these. Also notice that feature matching is important. While some of these tools might be really cool, they might not have the exact features for each one of your students. So it's important to recognize what do each of these tools offer, and then how are they going to actually help a student with executive functioning? And is it going to get in the way of executive functioning anywhere? So the following slides are also in your handouts, and they're going to give you some of those individual supports. So some of the low-tech, no-tech, paper and pencil type things like Post-it notes, notepads, calendars, highlighters, labels, all those things that most of us were used to using before computers really can help students who struggle with executive functioning now, if we can add that into their day. And then on the following slides, I do have some supports for iOS, some Chrome supports, and some extensions. So again, these are the ones I said we might not have time to get to, and that's completely fine. But they are here as resources for you to look at for the students who may be struggling with executive functioning and just supporting those environments and those systems in your classroom maybe aren't quite enough. There are some ideas there that you can use to kind of introduce into students' worlds to see if you can help support their organization, their time management, and then decrease some of those behaviors that come from anxiety or frustration. So I appreciate you coming and listening to me today and joining in the chat. If you have any questions or comments at any time, you can reach out to me at my email, or you can find me on Twitter. And then Mike, thank you so much for having me.
Cassie, thank you. That was awesome. I was just talking to Jen, who does this with me, Jen Savage, and she had to leave early. And she's like, I'm so glad I saw Cassie do this at ATIA. And I said, well, I didn't see that. And so I'm really happy I got to see. So that was excellent. We have a minute or two if people want to jump in and they have a question that's burning in their mind that they would like to ask. Please feel free. Again, a lot of thanks. That was good. I love that you showed momentum, Cassie. That's like my favorite Chrome extension. I'm a sucker for a tool that says hello to me with my name. That's it. That's all I want. All I want from a tool is just say, hi, Mike. That's nice. Good morning, Mike.
I like momentum because I can put a little list on the corner.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, the
so
little
like kind
list
of like
part
that
is
irritating
great.
to-do list that pops up.
Yeah. If you've never seen Momentum, again, I rarely use the list on the bottom. I do use that line on the front, like, what is my main goal of the day? And I have done that. And then every time I open a tab, there it is over and over again, just like being nice to me, but then reminding me subtly, oh, you better do something that you said you were going to do today. So love it.
My problem is I like the question, what are you going to do today? It makes me think about it, but I never remember to write it in.
Yeah, right. Well, and when I do, I'm so happy with myself. I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm going to do it. We have one more question from Chelsea there in the chat.
Any cool visuals or sites that offer good visuals for these? So a lot of times I end up going to lesson picks for my visuals. I find it to be one of the quickest ways to be able to do like a print visual. You can use it as like slides and stuff too, but I like that one. It's cost effective. And you can go ahead and like put in kind of the pictures that work really well for your students and then make a schedule for them and a book for them and kind of a preview of what's going to be happening. Chelsea, make our owner search them both. So you can make your own, but they do have a big library of visuals already there. So if anybody's made it and puts it out there kind of for others to see, you can start there. And Kristen added, if you have Canva, they have good visuals. It depends on what kind you're looking for. Canva can be great for that too. I like anything that's a visual.
That's great. Love it. Well, Cassie, thank you so much for your time today. And everybody, thanks for joining us today in person and being participatory. Love that. Always love that. Like I said in the beginning, we will post this recording up to our project website, which is nhatconnect.com. We'll post it up there so people can see the recording. And appreciate everybody. Thank you so much. Cassie, thank you.
Oh, and thank you for letting me come and talk about like two of my favorite things.
Well, there you go then. Everybody wins today, Cassie.
I know. Great.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon. Cassie, thanks again.
Have a great day. Thank you.
See ya.